Hello and welcome to episode number 10 of the Layton Fitness podcast. Now in today's episode we're going to be discussing carbohydrate requirements. Now carbohydrates of all of the macronutrients is the most variable. This is the one macronutrient which will be manipulated significantly whether your goal's fat loss or muscle gain. This is the macronutrient which will be moving the most. Whereas for the most part, protein is going to stay relatively constant. Don't get me wrong, it will move slightly higher during the fat loss phase, and fat will stay relatively constant as well for the most part. Don't get me wrong, you can still manipulate fat within the fat loss phase and the gaining phase. However, carbohydrates are going to get the blunt of the manipulation. Now it's important to know carbohydrates are neither good or bad. Despite your pre-existing beliefs about carbohydrates, the most important factor you need to understand is carbohydrate requirements will be dictated mainly by energy demands and also your goals as well. So for example, someone who has a sedentary job and they perhaps train once, twice a week, for the most part their carbohydrate requirements are going to be relatively low. Conversely, on the flip side, we have an endurance trainee that trains twice per day. This individual's carbohydrate requirement is going to be significantly higher. Now, added to that, as we've discussed in some of my previous podcasts, when I list off certain targets to work from, it's important to know these are just ballpark figures and they essentially need to be put to test in the real life. You're then going to measure your progress against these numbers and then you're going to manipulate the variables from there. So when I list off these figures, these are just ballpark starting points. Now unlike protein and fat, carbohydrates are not required for survival. However, it's important to know what's required for survival and what's optimal for you to achieve your body composition goals or your performance goals are two completely different things. Carbohydrates have some significant benefits, certainly within the context of endurance training and also strength training as well. So now I've got a brief overview of carbohydrates, why it's important, why it can be the most variable macronutrient. Let's look at how we can set these targets. So as we discussed before, there's a couple of different ways how we can set both caloric requirements and the macronutrient requirements as well. So firstly, a good example would be just to track your current food intake using a food diary or MyFitnessPal over the week. You can then see whether you lost weight or gained weight during that period, and hopefully you'd have just maintained your weight throughout the week, and that will basically give you unequivocal data of what are your total maintenance calories. The other option we can do is very basic calorie formula, which, just a little reminder, if you haven't already downloaded this from my site, if you go to James Layton, Layton fitness.co.uk, you can download this, and this ebook will essentially teach you how to do that. But there's various other calculators online, and as I've stated before, these aren't set in stone, but they can essentially give you a starting point to work from. They're all very similar. So once you've set calories, you're then going to set protein within that. So I've discussed before, anywhere between 2 to 3.1 grams per kilogram of body weight. And as I discussed on some of the other episodes, for the most part, protein requirements are going to be slightly higher during a fat loss phase. Essentially, amino acid oxidation will be higher during this phase, and for a gaining phase, because you'll be in a net energy surplus, you can work on the lower end. Approximately between those two figures, and that's not to say that you may require slightly more than that or a little bit less than that, but as I've stated before, with protein it's better to have a little bit too much than too little, because too much there's not going to be any significant negative effects, whereas too little there'll be some big negative effects, mainly lean mass loss during a dieting phase. Now once we've set protein, we're then going to set dietary fat intake, because remember, meeting that essential fatty acid intake is crucial. So therefore we'll set this anywhere between 0.5 to 1.5 grams per kilogram of body weight. Now as I've stated on some of my previous episodes, I like to use protein and fat targets based off total body weight for most individuals. However, there's a caveat to that. If you're an overweight individual or anyone above 20% body fat, for males that is, 25% body fat for females. It's worth setting these requirements based on your goal body weight. So for example, if you're 100 kilograms and you'd like to be 80 kilograms, set these protein and fat requirements based on your goal body weight, 80 kilograms, because otherwise protein and fat are going to be set way too high. Now once we've set that, we can essentially set carbohydrates. So essentially carbohydrates are going to fill the remaining calories. Personally, I have some special preference for carbohydrates for certain individuals. Those individuals who seem to tolerate more carbohydrates, I do have a preference for having higher carbohydrates and less fat intake. And the main reason being, regardless of when you're in a gaining phase or a fat loss phase, high carbohydrates have some significant benefits in terms of gym performance mainly. So if we can maintain your strength better in the gym during a fat loss phase, this is going to essentially preserve lean muscle mass during the fat loss phase. Conversely, when we're in a muscle gaining phase, carbohydrates are going to really help with not only hypertrophy, but secondly, allowing you to move more total load in the gym, therefore adding more volume over a chronic period of time and therefore achieving more muscle growth, which is what you're after. So therefore I have a preference towards slightly higher carbohydrate intakes. Now it's important to note that, especially during a fat loss phase, once protein has been set and once calories have been set, the ratio to carbs to fats doesn't really matter in the context of fat loss. Now with that being said, as I mentioned, it can still be important, especially when we consider maintaining gym performance, e.g. focusing on a slightly higher carbohydrate intake to try and preserve that training performance and therefore preserve lean muscle mass. However, there are certain individuals that do so much better on a higher fat intake, lower carbohydrate intake. So again, it's a case of putting something in place, seeing how you progress, and then manipulate things from there. Now, with regards to meeting the total carbohydrate requirements, there's no magic foods. As I discussed, certainly in the clean eating myth, you cannot say whether an isolation food is good or bad without looking at the composition of the whole diet, that individual's goals, and also the dose of that food within a diet as well. However, with that being said, whole foods should dominate the majority of your diet, but that being said, there's no reason why you cannot have some of your favourite indulgences within that. Now, it's also important to look at the context of what I just mentioned there. So, for example, if you're in a fat loss phase and your calories are much lower, it's in your best interest to mainly focus on whole food sources in this context for a number of reasons. One, we don't have any potential micronutrient deficiencies during the fat loss phase, mainly because your calories are lower. Secondly, satiation. For the most part, whole foods, higher in fibre, are generally going to make you feel fuller, and this is going to help with adherence during the fat loss phase. In addition to that, it will also help with how you feel. If your calories are really low and you just all of your carbohydrates and sugar, you're just going to feel like rubbish, basically. With that being said, as I mentioned, there's no reason why you couldn't have a little bit of any food you enjoy within moderation. Conversely, someone who's in a gaining phase where their carbohydrates are significantly higher, firstly, micronutrient deficiencies is very unlikely in this circumstance, purely because their calories are so much higher. Therefore, this will allow a little bit more processed food in moderation if you choose to, and also, especially for certain individuals, meeting a total carbohydrate requirement in a muscle gaining phase can be exceptionally difficult just eating whole food alone. So that individual will have more calories to play with, therefore he could have some more indulgences within there as well. So hopefully you can see the difference between the fat loss and the gaining phase. I'm not saying just go out there and just eat absolute rubbish. I do believe for the most part it should be whole food, but hopefully you can see the difference between the fat loss and the gaining phase. In the gaining phase you almost have more total calories to play with, and therefore you could have a little bit more food you enjoy within those targets. Now let's talk about manipulating carbohydrates within the context of fat loss. So as I've discussed on my previous episodes, the key with this is having daily targets, macronutrient targets, having a progressive resistance program, adding cardio if and when required, measuring your progress, and then when you hit a plateau, making a change. So for example, if you did hit a plateau for 1 to 2 weeks, probably would be a good thing to either decrease calories and or increase expenditure via cardio. So with regards to the total amount you could potentially drop from carbohydrates, this really isn't a black and white figure, and it's really difficult to gauge. But a good starting point is a 5 to 10% drop in calories. As you become leaner, you probably want to be on the lower end, so 5%, and if you've got a little bit more body fat to lose, you could be on the higher end. You can make a 10% adjustment. Now, do we just drop carbohydrates, or do we drop a combination of carbohydrates and fats? Again, this really depends on the person, depends on how high their fat intake is, how high their carbohydrate intake is. But for the most part, it's either going to be carbohydrates on its own or carbs and fats. For the most part, protein is going to stay pretty much constant throughout the fat loss phase. So sorry I can't give you black and white answers, but it really does just depend. Making manipulations to carbohydrates during a gaining phase. Again, this is almost exactly the same, but with the opposite in terms of adding carbohydrates rather than reducing them. So if you've hit a plateau in your muscle gaining phase, again, you could increase calories by 5 to 10%, either just carbohydrates or a combination of mainly carbohydrates and a little bit of fats. Again, it really depends on the individual. It's hard to give some black and white answers, but hopefully you got the general idea for both a fat loss and or gaining phase. Now, what about carbohydrate cycling? So I've actually discussed this in some of my other episodes, but just to give you a quick indication of my views on carb cycling, it can be a very useful tool. However, for the most part, it simply isn't really necessary. Let me explain why. It's important to note that if you're a weight training individual, even though your expenditure will vary from a training day compared to a non-training day, e.g. you'll burn more calories on the training day compared to the non-training day, just remember you're doing weight training here. You're not doing an endurance activity. So if I was working with, say, an endurance trainer who trains twice per day, by default, calories and carbohydrate requirements will need to be much higher on training days versus non-training days. Just by default, it's going to be the case. Whereas for someone looking to either gain muscle or lose body fat, it's important to look at our ultimate goal is for the fat loss individuals to create that net energy deficit over a chronic period of time. Whether we fluctuate calories on day to day or keep them the same, it doesn't really matter as long as that net energy deficit is there. Conversely, for a gaining individual, again, we're focusing on a net energy surplus, regardless of whether we've got higher calories and carbohydrates on training day to non-training day. However, that's not to say if you had a preference towards doing that, you could do that. Just remember the ultimate goal for either fat loss or muscle growth. So hopefully that makes sense. I'm not saying you cannot use it, but for most individuals it's simply not necessary. Another just a quick point, I've discussed high carbohydrate refeed days on another episode, and in some ways that is a more beneficial approach within the context of fat loss. So I suggest you go listen to that, but essentially you're having a higher carbohydrate refeed day when required rather than just a random carb cycling approach. Now, with regards to timing carbohydrates, again, I've discussed in quite a lot of depth in some of my other episodes. Timing is not much of a concern for individuals looking to improve their body composition. Therefore, it's more about the total calories, macronutrients met by the end of the day in comparison to, say, an endurance trainee who trains twice per day within an 8-hour period where speed of glycogen resynthesis is very important between session 1 and session 2. Conversely, with a weight training individual, for the most part, their next training session will be 24 hours away and beyond. So as long as they meet their total carbohydrate requirement by the end of the day, glycogen resynthesis will take care of itself for the following session, which is the most important factor. But with that being said, it's not to say that timing of carbohydrates is completely irrelevant. Important to look at the performance of the session itself, and I would recommend having some carbohydrates 1 to 2 hours prior to training, just because for the most individuals, performance in the gym will be somewhat improved. However, there are some individuals that train with little carbohydrates pre-workout and they're absolutely fine. And then post-workout, you just let the remaining carbohydrates needed before the end of the day just be met within your preference, so wherever you like to consume it. So hopefully that makes sense. And I've discussed that in detail in some of the other podcasts. And if you're just thinking in your head, what about quote-unquote insulin? Because I know there'll be some people listening who think insulin is very important post-workout. Firstly, it's important to know that protein is very insulinogenic in itself. Secondly, if we have a pre-exercise meal 1 to 2 hours prior to training, insulin is going to be above fasted levels during the session itself and for several hours post-workout. So insulin is already going to be elevated essentially. Just thought I'd mention that for people that are thinking, you need to spike insulin post-workout. It's almost done by default with protein and or the pre-exercise meal 1 to 2 hours prior to training. So hopefully you've really enjoyed this episode. Like I said, a constant theme you'll probably get on my podcast is nothing's black and white, and every time I give a recommendation, I have to put it within a certain context, and that recommendation will potentially change for another individual. But that's one of the most important factors I want you to take away from this podcast is nothing is black and white. It all depends on the individual, depends on their goals. You're essentially using everything as tools, and then you're applying those tools within your own individual circumstance. Hopefully you've really learned a lot from this, and more importantly, like I said on the last episode, you're actually applying this and you're starting to see results. If you'd like to learn more about me, if you go to James Layton Fitness.co.uk, so Layton, I've got over 100 videos on there. The other episodes of the podcast, lots of blog posts, articles. Like I mentioned, you can sign up to my free ebook, which teaches you how to set up a nutrition plan. So if you go on the website, James Layton, Layton Fitness.co.uk, you can sign up to that at the top of the page. And I've also got various services on there as well, so you can take a look at that. Okay, thank you very much, guys. I look forward to speaking to you next week. Take care.